Okay, this is Roy Spears at the University of Arizona campus. Beautiful day out here in February 2012. And what I want to talk today about is a new group, religious group that's on campus. They've been making the rounds about a year that I've known, a year and a half. These are the people that refer to themselves, they use a term called God the Mother. And they say that without God the Mother, you cannot be saved. Now, I met these guys, like I said, about a year and a half ago here on campus. Two young men were dressed in suits and carrying big Bibles. They were talking to students here on campus. And this is always interesting to me when I see students or people on campus carrying Bibles or engaged in, topics of religion, because I do a lot of evangelism, a lot of open-air preaching here at the U of A. And as I got close to them, I could hear that they were talking about God the Mother. I thought that was very interesting. Hadn't heard that before. And so, over a series of a couple of more months, a couple of semesters, I started asking more questions about this group. Now, they're very secretive. They don't come right out and tell anybody that I know of where they're from, what church that they go to. But they're based out of South Korea. And from what I can gather, it is called the World Missionary Society Church of God, founded by a Korean man who is now dead. And his name is Sahng-Hong or something like that. And this man, from what I gather, their members claim that he is the second coming Christ. Well, it's very interesting as I talk to some of these people. It took me many interactions with them before I could even figure out exactly where they were coming from. And what these people believe in, and it's a very evil type of doctrine that they use. But they go into, and one of their most important verses that they use is Galatians chapter 4, verse 26. And I'm reading out of the New King James Version. It says this: "But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all." And so they take this one verse and they build this doctrine around it, believing that as they pull this scripture out, they believe that there is the Mother God, that God is composed of two parts, God the Mother, God the Father. And they use this particular verse to kind of bolster their false viewpoint about this. Now, the very interesting thing that I want to bring up is how many cults will take verses out of context, lift them right out of context without reading the surrounding verses. And it's very clear. Let me read this to you. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 24, the Apostle Paul writes, "Which things are symbolic." Now, if you read out of the New American Standard Translation, it uses the word figuratively, or symbolically here in the New King James. And so Paul is talking about a figurative, a metaphor, an allegory, when he talks about God or Jerusalem being the mother. And let me just read to you a little bit, starting with verse 22 of Galatians chapter 4, again out of the New King James Version. It says, "For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondwoman, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise. Which things are symbolic, or again, allegorical in another translation. For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children, but the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all." Now, it's very interesting about how cults will take a verse, like I said earlier, lift it completely out of the context of which we find it in. But an allegory, what is an allegory? An allegory, I looked up in the dictionary, is this: an allegory is a story in which people, things, and happenings have another meaning, as in a fable or a parable. Allegories are used for teaching or explaining, the presenting of ideas by means of such stories, symbolic narration or description. Now, that's taken right out of the Webster's New World Dictionary. So that's what Paul is talking about. Paul is going in to talk about that this whole situation that he's using, talking about, the bondwoman, the free woman, is all allegorical. It's not to be taken literally, not at all. Now, what is a metaphor? You know, the Bible uses quite a bit of metaphors, and a metaphor is a figure of speech in which one thing is likened to another. Different thing by being spoken of as if it were that other thing. So let me read this again. A metaphor is a figure of speech in which one thing is likened to another different thing by being spoken of as if it were that other thing. For example, Jesus used metaphors. In John 6:35, Jesus said, "I am the bread of life." Now, obviously, Jesus is not referring to himself as a literal loaf of bread. You know, it's a metaphor. And Jesus used metaphors frequently throughout the New Testament, throughout the Gospels. Another metaphor that Jesus used is in John chapter 10, verse 9, where it says, "I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved." So now Jesus isn't saying that he's a wooden door, right, with a frame around himself. He's not saying that he's literally a door. He's referring to a metaphor. And this is exactly what Paul is saying. Paul is using an allegory, a metaphor, to describe these things. Now, there's other things that I could talk about this World Missionary Society Church of God, but I just want to emphasize this one point. And if you're a member of this church, and you have to read in context what Paul the Apostle was saying, you cannot walk away from Galatians chapter 4, verse 26, where it says, "But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all," and you can't build a doctrine, a false doctrine, that there is such a thing as the God the Mother. And, you know, we don't want to look foolish, because once a person reads these verses in context, well, it becomes very clear that this metaphor is not talking about a literal God the Mother. And I would ask that all of you who are involved in this cult would do your research. Read these verses in context. That's one of the things that cults always do. They will lift an isolated verse out of context without taking into consideration, you know, the surrounding verses, the situation that was being spoken of, the